begin, Elliot had always taken pride in his work. Construction project management wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling. Every project had its challenges, and Elliot thrived on solving them. His days were long, his muscles ached, and his hands bore the scars of countless hours spent in the field. But at the end of each day, he returned home to Sophia, his wife of 8 years. That night, however, home felt different. The first sign was the suitcase by the door. Its polished leather exterior gleamed under the hallway light, a stark, unfamiliar sight in their shared space. Sophia sat on the couch, her back unnaturally straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Elliot," she began as he stepped inside, her voice light but strained. "We need to talk." Elliot placed his keys on the counter, his gut tightening. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. Sophia's smile wavered. "I'm going away," she said, pausing for what felt like an eternity before adding, "with Carter." The name hit Elliot like a punch to the chest. Carter was Sophia's boss, a man Elliot had met only a handful of times but had disliked instantly. Carter exuded arrogance, his every word laced with condescension. Sophia rushed to explain, her voice rising in pitch as though that could soften the blow. "It's just for a week," she said. "I need this, Elliot. We need this. Carter thinks it'll be good for me, for us." Elliot's mind raced, but he stayed silent, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the counter. Sophia interpreted his silence as agreement, continuing with an unsettling mix of guilt and excitement. "I've already packed," she said, gesturing toward the suitcase. "I'll be back Friday, and then we can move forward. You'll see. Everything will go back to normal." Before leaving, Sophia handed Elliot a piece of paper. "Carter thought this might help," she said. "It's just some guidelines to keep things peaceful while I'm gone." Elliot unfolded the paper, his stomach churning as he read the list. No arguments before or after the trip. Do not discuss the trip with anyone. No social media posts referencing the trip. Stay calm and wait at home. Sophia smiled, as if the words were reasonable. "Carter respects you," she said. "He knows you'll handle this with maturity." Elliot didn't respond. He watched her walk out the door, her suitcase in tow, her parting words echoing in his mind. "This doesn't change anything. I love you, Elliot." The door clicked shut, and with it, something inside Elliot snapped. Elliot sat at the kitchen table long after Sophia left, the crumpled list clenched in his hand. He had always been a man of logic and planning. Whether managing construction crews or balancing budgets, Elliot knew the value of a solid plan. He pulled out a notebook and began writing, each line more decisive than the last. Restrict financial access. Change the locks. Sell the house. Compile evidence. Contact Carter's wife. Rebuild his life without her. This wasn't just about reacting. This was about taking control. The next morning, Elliot met with his lawyer. By the time the sun set, their joint accounts were frozen, the locks had been changed, and the house was listed for sale. Sophia's belongings were boxed and moved into storage, with a detailed inventory sent to her email. Elliot found an unexpected sense of clarity as he worked. Each step he took stripped away the pain, replacing it with determination. By the end of the day, the house was a blank canvas, ready for a new chapter. Sophia stepped off the plane in Paris, the crisp evening air greeting her like a lover. Carter had spared no expense. Their first-class flight was just the beginning. Champagne, luxury cars, and a suite overlooking the Seine were all part of the fantasy he'd promised her. The night unfolded in a blur of elegance and indulgence. Carter was charming and attentive, guiding her through the streets like a tour guide, whisking her from one Michelin-starred restaurant to another. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, swept away by Carter's touch, the way he smiled at her, as though she was the center of his world. For a brief moment, she let herself believe that perhaps this was the life she had been waiting for, the life Elliot could never give her. But by the second day, the cracks started to show. Carter's attention began to wane. What had seemed like affection turned cold. His phone became his main focus, and Sophia's attempts to make him laugh were met with distracted responses. He spoke to her as though she were a minor inconvenience, her presence more of an accessory than an actual partner. Sophia tried to push it out of her mind, telling herself it was just stress, or maybe he was tired from the flight. But every passing hour felt like a step further away from the fantasy she had built in her mind. Back in the city, Elliot wasn't letting the passing days numb the pain. He was using them to get even. His lawyer worked swiftly to ensure that all shared finances were locked down. The house was now officially for sale, and Elliot had started calling contractors to prepare for renovations in his new place. Each call he made was a deliberate step toward reclaiming the life Sophia had taken for granted. Elliot found solace in the work. It gave him a sense of purpose, a clarity he had lacked in the weeks leading up to the betrayal. Every minute spent revamping his own life was another minute Sophia and Carter would never get back. But his quiet revenge wasn't just about cutting ties. Elliot began to use his connections, subtly reaching out to mutual friends, ensuring that word of Sophia's affair spread, even if it had to be whispered in the right circles. Meanwhile, he kept track of her every move. Sophia had always been careless with her phone, assuming Elliot would never go through her personal messages. But Elliot had anticipated her moves. When Sophia had left, she'd taken the phone, but Elliot knew her passwords. She trusted him too much to lock anything away. After a few minutes of careful hacking, he had access to everything. Her messages, her emails, and a trove of photos. It was all there, proof of the affair in graphic detail, each text more degrading than the last. Sophia had let Carter convince her that Elliot's silence was a sign of weakness. What she hadn't known was that her silence was about to cost her everything. By the fourth day of their stay, Sophia's unease grew as Carter's attentiveness continued to fade. The glamorous dinner dates were still there, but now they felt empty, like a stage production with no audience. The luxury of the trip started to feel like a gilded cage, and Carter's disdain for her began to show. It wasn't the words, but the looks, the dismissive gestures, the times he walked out of the room without explanation. He was no longer the man who had wooed her with promises of adventure. He was just a man who had grown bored. It wasn't until their last night in Paris that the reality set in. After a brief, strained dinner, Carter invited two other women to join them in the hotel suite. Sophia, stunned, tried to protest, but Carter's cold response left no room for argument. "Sleep on the couch," he said, his voice almost mocking. "If you're not joining us, then you can be the guest." Sophia stared at him, a sick feeling crawling up her throat. The man who had once looked at her like she was the center of his universe was now dismissing her as though she was nothing. The hurt was raw, but it wasn't just pain, it was humiliation. She spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. How had she gotten here? How had she gone from the woman who had been deeply loved by her husband to a trophy in Carter's playbook, discarded and ignored? When Sophia finally called Carter out on his behavior the next day, the response was chilling in its indifference. "Don't make a big deal out of this," Carter said dismissively. "It's just fun, just for us to enjoy. You knew what this was about when you came here." His words felt like a slap in the face. In that moment, Sophia realized that her value to him had always been superficial. She was no longer the woman he wanted to cherish. She was just a distraction, a temporary fix for his own boredom. Sophia found herself longing for Elliot, the man she had taken for granted. She remembered how he had always made her feel secure, loved, and important. He hadn't been flashy or extravagant, but his love had been real, uncomplicated, steady, and deep. As she stared out the window at the bustling Paris streets, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that she had made a grave mistake. There was no escaping the truth now. Carter didn't care about her. And what was worse, she had known this from the start. Sophia returned home with her head spinning. The trip had been a disaster, not just because of Carter's coldness, but because of the painful realization that she had been chasing an illusion. The man she had thought would validate her was nothing more than a fleeting fantasy. And in the process, she had lost everything that truly mattered: her marriage, her home, and the trust of the man who had always stood by her. She was exhausted from the emotional toll, her confidence shattered. Yet, she still clung to the belief that things could return to normal. She had expected Elliot to be waiting for her with open arms, ready to forgive her transgressions. But as she pulled into the driveway, the first thing she saw was the for sale sign in front of their home. Her heart dropped. She hurried inside, calling for Elliot, but the house was eerily quiet. Nothing was left. The furniture had been moved, the shelves bare. The locks had been changed, and the door wouldn't open. Panic surged through her chest as she realized that Elliot had already left her behind, completely. She had thought she could walk away from her marriage and return to it without consequences, but the consequences were staring her in the face now. Sophia's heart raced as she tried calling Elliot, only to find that his phone had been disconnected. Desperation grew as she called her parents, but their responses only confirmed her worst fears. "Elliot's gone, Sophia," her father said quietly. "He filed for divorce. It's over." Sophia collapsed into her mother's arms, overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. All of her actions had led to this moment, and the weight of her choices pressed down on her like 1,000 pounds. She had gambled everything on a fantasy, and now she had lost it all. Sophia stood in her parents' living room, her mind a blur as her father's words echoed in her head. "It's over, Sophia. He's gone?" She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Everything had unraveled so quickly, and the weight of what she had done hit her like a freight train. She had walked away from Elliot, assuming he would forgive her. That was her biggest mistake. She'd underestimated him, assumed his love was unconditional, and that he would take her back, no matter how far she pushed him. She hadn't realized that the life they had built together was built on trust and respect, and once that trust was shattered, there was no going back. Her mother tried to console her, but Sophia could barely hear her. The room spun around her as she replayed the events of the past few days in her head. Carter had abandoned her. Her marriage was over, and Elliot had cut every tie. She pulled her phone out, dialing Elliot's number one more time. But as expected, it went straight to voicemail. She left a message, her voice trembling with desperation. "Elliot, please? I don't know what I was thinking. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. I want to fix this. Please just talk to me." But deep down, Sophia knew it was too late. The man she had relied on, the man she had betrayed, was gone. He wasn't coming back. Elliot didn't respond to Sophia's calls. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. He had already made his decision, and the more time passed, the clearer his resolve became. His lawyer had been quick to draft the divorce papers. He didn't want any drawn-out drama or long, painful confrontations. Sophia had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and now she would face the consequences of her actions. Elliot had already arranged for everything. The house was officially sold, and the money was in his account. He had contacted the contractors to start renovating his new place, transforming it into something that was entirely his. No more shared memories, no more traces of Sophia. This was his fresh start. Sophia was still under the illusion that she could fix things, that her charm and tearful apologies could somehow undo what she had done. But Elliot knew better. There was no going back from this. As he sat in his new apartment, his mind wandered to the final part of his plan, the revenge. He had everything he needed now. The evidence of Sophia's affair, Carter's arrogance exposed, and the knowledge that everything they had built was now his to destroy. Sophia had taken everything for granted. But Elliot wasn't just going to leave her with a clean slate. He wanted her to feel every ounce of pain he had felt. He wasn't going to give her the luxury of walking away unscathed. Sophia tried to contact Elliot again, this time through a letter. She poured her heart out in it, writing about how deeply sorry she was and how much she regretted what she had done. She even tried to justify her actions, blaming her insecurities, her desire for validation, and the emotional distance she had felt from him in recent months. But in the end, her words were hollow. She had lost her chance to fix things the moment she walked away with Carter. When Elliot received the letter, he felt nothing but indifference. He didn't even read it all the way through. The letter wasn't an apology. It was a plea, a final attempt to cling to the illusion that things could go back to the way they were. Elliot did something that surprised even him. He shredded the letter and tossed it in the trash. There was nothing to fix, and nothing she could say could ever change what had happened. Meanwhile, word of Sophia's affair began to spread. Elliot had made sure of that. He had shared the evidence with a few of their closest friends, knowing that gossip would spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for people to start whispering to start putting the pieces together. Sophia's perfect image was crumbling. Her colleagues began to distance themselves. Her reputation at work was tarnished, and even her family began to question her actions. She had underestimated just how far Elliot was willing to go to make her feel the weight of her betrayal. Elliot wasn't finished yet. Carter hadn't just betrayed him by having an affair with his wife. He had humiliated him. He had assumed that Elliot would just move on, that he was too passive to take action. But Carter had gravely misjudged Elliot. Using the evidence Elliot had gathered, he reached out to Carter's wife, Emma. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about exposing Carter for what he truly was, a manipulative, self-serving liar. He sent her the messages, the photos, and the emails, everything that could leave Carter's reputation in tatters. Emma was stunned when she received the email. The next day, she confronted Carter. Their marriage, like Sophia's and Elliot's, crumbled under the weight of the truth. Carter's business dealings, once seen as successful and prestigious, began to unravel. Lawsuits piled up against him, and the press caught wind of his shady dealings. Elliot didn't care about the details of Carter's fall from grace. What mattered was that Carter had been brought down to the level he deserved. The man who had made him feel small and insignificant was now facing the same humiliation he had inflicted on others. Sophia finally understood the full scope of what she had lost. Her world, which had seemed so secure and perfect when she was with Carter, had fallen apart. The luxurious dinners, the attention, the promises, they had all turned out to be lies. Carter wasn't the man she had imagined. He had used her, discarded her, and left her with nothing. Sophia's attempts to contact Elliot grew more frantic. She showed up at his new apartment, pleading with him to give her a second chance. But each time, he turned her away. She began to feel the weight of her choices crushing her. She had always assumed Elliot's love would be unshakable, that he would forgive her no matter what. But she had miscalculated. She had taken his love for granted, and now that love was gone. Her phone was buzzing constantly with calls and messages from friends and family, asking if she was okay. The gossip had reached everyone. She was no longer the successful, confident woman she had once been. She was a woman scorned, a woman abandoned, a woman who had betrayed the one person who had always been there for her. And now, there was nothing left. Elliot had achieved what he set out to do. The marriage was over, his revenge was complete, and Carter's downfall had been swift. But what he had truly gained was freedom. Sophia and Carter thought they had played a game of power and control, but in the end, it was Elliot who had the last laugh. He had rebuilt his life, and now, he was moving forward. The new chapter of his life was just beginning, one where he could breathe freely, without the weight of betrayal hanging over him. And as he stood on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the city lights flicker below, he realized that revenge had never been about punishing them. It had been about reclaiming his life. Months passed, and Elliot continued to thrive. His career soared as he worked harder than ever. His relationships with friends deepened, and his newfound confidence gave him the freedom to explore a future full of possibility. Sophia, on the other hand, had to rebuild from the ground up. She never regained the life she had once known, and the scar of her betrayal followed her wherever she went. In the end, Elliot had won not because of the revenge he had taken, but because he had rebuilt his life on his terms. He had reclaimed his dignity, his self-respect, and his happiness. And that, he realized, was the greatest revenge of all. Sophia could feel the world closing in around her. Every time she opened her eyes, she saw a life she could no longer reach. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, biting at her resolve as she tried to navigate through the wreckage of her past decisions. Her calls to Elliot had gone unanswered. His silence was more painful than anything he could have said to her. It was the final death blow to a relationship she had once believed would stand the test of time. Her relationship with Carter had also reached its breaking point. He wasn't the man she thought he was. The initial thrill had worn off, replaced with the crushing realization that she had been nothing more than a temporary distraction. Carter had moved on swiftly, his interest in her fading as quickly as it had started. Sophia began to realize that the life she had chased after, the one filled with opulence and excitement, had been a mirage. It had been built on the ashes of her marriage, And now, as the truth settled in, she had nothing left but regret. She tried to focus on rebuilding herself, but the weight of her actions continued to drag her down. Her career, once a source of pride, had begun to falter. Her colleagues whispered behind her back, her reputation tarnished by the affair and the public exposure of her betrayal. The loneliness was unbearable. She was cut off from the people who once supported her, and the few friends who remained were too polite to mention what they knew. Elliot, on the other hand, was flourishing. His revenge had not just been about retribution, it had been about reclaiming his life. After everything he had endured, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let go. The new apartment he had bought was a symbol of his new beginning. It was sleek, modern, and entirely his own. The walls were bare, waiting to be filled with memories that were yet to come. He threw himself into his work, his career soaring as he took on bigger projects with renewed vigor. With each success, he gained more confidence, and his social circle expanded. He began dating again, but this time with more caution. He wasn't looking for a rebound. He was looking for someone who valued him for who he was, not for what he could give them. Elliot's life was no longer consumed by the betrayal. He had moved past it, leaving it behind as a painful chapter. He didn't need closure from Sophia anymore. He had found it within himself. Sophia's world continued to spiral downward. She had made countless mistakes, but it wasn't until she saw the divorce papers that she realized just how final it all was. The papers had been served months ago, but now, with no distractions to dull the sting, they felt like a dagger to her heart. She hadn't expected to hear from Elliot again, but a part of her had hoped he would reconsider, that he would forgive her. She had imagined countless scenarios in which they would sit down and talk things through, where she could apologize and make amends. But as the weeks turned into months, she saw that hope for what it was delusional. Still, she found herself drafting one final letter to him. This time, she knew there would be no excuses, no justifications. It was simply an apology, an honest, raw plea for forgiveness. Elliot, I know that I don't deserve anything from you, but I need to say this. What I did was unforgivable. I hurt you in the worst way, and I can never take that back. I was selfish, and I let my own insecurities cloud everything we had. You were always there for me, and I chose someone else, someone who didn't value me the way you did. I have lost everything, and I don't know how to make it right. I can't ask for your forgiveness, but I hope you find peace in whatever you choose. Please know that I am truly sorry, and that I will carry this regret for the rest of my life. Sophia. When Elliot received the letter, he read it, but the weight of it didn't hit him the way it used to. He didn't feel anger anymore, or even bitterness. He simply felt a deep, profound sadness for her, but more so for the life they could have had things been different. Elliot didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already let go, and the chapter of his life with Sophia was closed. But the letter sat with him for a long time. He didn't regret the steps he had taken to rebuild his life, but he did feel a pang of sorrow for the woman who had once been his wife. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. Sophia's descent into regret continued, but the world was no longer as unforgiving as it had seemed at first. Slowly, she started to rebuild, this time from the ground up. She moved to a smaller apartment, one that didn't carry the weight of memories with Elliot. The job she had once taken for granted now felt like a lifeline, something that gave her a sense of purpose beyond the destruction she had caused. But the pain of losing Elliot, of losing the love she had so thoughtlessly discarded, never fully went away. It haunted her, a constant reminder of her mistakes. As the months passed, Sophia focused on healing. She went to therapy, worked on rebuilding her career, and started to reconnect with people she had once pushed away. But nothing filled the hole left by Elliot. Nothing ever would. Elliot had fully embraced his new life. He dated Lila, a woman who saw him for who he was, not for what he could give. She brought him joy without the weight of expectations or deceit. Their relationship was built on trust and honesty, two things he had learned to value above all else. Sophia had faded into the background of his mind. He didn't need to obsess over her anymore. He had reclaimed his peace, his happiness. But he would never forget what had happened. The betrayal, the revenge, and the lessons learned from it. They had all shaped him into the man he was now, stronger, more self-aware, and more determined to live on his own terms. He knew that life had a way of balancing the scales, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. Years passed, and Elliot's life continued to thrive. He remained friends with some of the people who had been a part of his life before the betrayal, but the weight of his past no longer defined him. Sophia, on the other hand, had made peace with her choices. She still felt the sting of losing Elliot, but she had learned to live with the consequences of her actions. She never stopped regretting what she had done, but over time, the sharp pain dulled into a quiet ache. One day, years after their divorce, Sophia received a message from Elliot. It was simple, just a message to check in, to see how she was doing. It was a final acknowledgement that the past was over, and they had both moved on. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. It was peace. And for both of them, that was enough.